I'm Heidi Rader here in the Alaska Garden. I'm an associate professor of extension with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I'm going to talk all about growing vegetables, flowers, and berries productively and sustainably in Alaska. Gardening for the first time can be daunting, especially in Alaska with the added challenges of a short growing season, sometimes too cool weather, and sometimes very hot weather. Although the internet provides a wealth of information, when you've never done something before, sometimes you don't even know what questions to ask. Here are some questions you may not have known to ask. The first thing to think about when starting a garden is where are you going to put it? An ideal garden spot would get 8 or more hours of direct sunlight, have rich, loose soil that is free of weeds, rocks, and roots, be a good distance from trees and shrubs, have an easily accessible water source, and have an 8-foot high fence to keep moose and other pests out. That's the ideal, but many of us garden in less than ideal spots because that's what we have available. However, it's something to work toward if you can. The next question to ask is, do you want to grow in containers, raised beds, or in ground? Container gardening can be a good option for those who do not have a spot to plant a garden in the ground. But containers can be challenging to keep watered. A container may need to be watered 2 to 3 times a day in the heat of the summer. You'll want to make sure you use good potting soil rather than just digging up soil you may have in your backyard. For one, that type of soil may be very heavy and hard to move. Also, you need to optimize growing conditions in containers because of the added stress on plants. Raised beds can be a nice route for new gardeners as well. They can be made out of a variety of materials, including wood, cement, or metal. Anything non-toxic that will not rot quickly. They require less watering than containers, but still more than gardening in the ground. There are a few advantages to raised beds. They warm up and retain heat in the summer. They can be placed on a deck, on rocky soil, or on top of a lawn, and they minimize the amount of soil you need to bring in and keep good soil from getting trampled on and compacted. Another advantage of raised beds is that there are lots of ways to make it so weeds don't grow where you walk. For example, the walkways between the raised beds could be cement, rock, mulch, or weed fabric. Weeding walkways is not a fun task. Keep your growing space for growing and your walkways for walking. Finally, if you do have a spot to garden in the ground, this can be a good way to grow deep-rooted crops like potatoes and often requires less watering than containers or raised beds. If you get tree roots or weeds growing in your garden, you can deal with them more easily with a rototiller than you can if weeds and roots get into a raised bed. So what can you grow? Once you've decided where to put your garden, the next big decision is what to grow. The easiest things to grow in Alaska are things that mature quickly and don't mind cool weather. That said, even though radishes and spinach are some of the fastest growing, quickest to maturing crops, they have a pesky habit of going to seed, or in other words, bolting, because of our long, sometimes hot days. Some of the easiest crops to grow are kale, peas, snap beans, lettuce, beets, carrots, turnips, and potatoes. All of these crops can be directly seeded or planted outside in the ground, as opposed to many crops that need to be planted indoors to give them a head start so that they mature before the growing season ends. It's best to start zucchini, broccoli, cabbage, tomatoes, and mini flowers indoors before planting them outside. Corn, winter squash, giant cabbage, Brussels sprouts, peppers, and eggplants can be grown, but they are a bit more challenging because they take longer to mature and may require more heat and sun than other crops. As a first-time gardener, try the easy crops first before you tackle more challenging crops. My favorite things to grow are ones that are best eaten fresh and ones that I can harvest and eat all summer long. What varieties should you choose? Not only do you need to choose crops, you also need to choose which variety of each crop to grow. There are many varieties of carrots, for example. Some mature early, some late, some are purple, some yellow, some are sweeter, some are better for storage. At the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we trial how different varieties of carrots and many other crops perform, so you can consult the reports for what has performed best. Another key to successful gardening is timing. When you plant, water, fertilize, weed, and harvest matters. So when should you plant? You should plant your garden as early as you can, which means after you are reasonably assured it is not going to freeze or get close to freezing. Some people use frost cloth so that they can protect the plants from a light frost and plant earlier. Sometimes frosts can be unpredictable, but you can base your planting date off the average last spring frost as well as a look at the weather forecast. According to the Alaska Garden Helper website, the Fairbanks growing season starts May 9th and ends September 23rd. In other words, this is the frost-free season, or the season when temperatures usually are above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, that is an average, so sometimes it's going to be later and sometimes earlier. You can look up the average growing season wherever you live in Alaska on the Alaska Garden Helper. You can view past, present, and predicted growing season information. When you're growing transplants or starts indoors, it's important to start plants at the right time. What is the right time? The right time basically has to do with how big the plant will be when you plant outside. Not too small, but also not too big for its britches, so to speak, or container. I like to use Johnny Seed's calculator to figure out what the right time is. It's not perfect for Alaska. For instance, the calculator includes some crops that will likely not mature in Alaska. Even if you start melons and okra indoors at the time the calculator recommends, that doesn't mean they will mature enough to be harvested in Alaska due to the length of our growing season and amount of heat we get. How far apart should you space your plants? Spacing is an important key to successful gardening too. If plants are too close together, they're not going to mature. However, if they're too far apart, you're wasting space and end up doing a lot of extra weeding and watering. Sometimes the best method is to plant more thickly than you should, but go back and thin. Sometimes people plant at the right spacing at the beginning, and then they don't have to thin. That takes some extra patience and a seed bed with nice soil to ensure most of the plants germinate. Is your soil good for growing? Getting a soil test is one way to assess if your soil is good for growing. The test will determine your soil pH. Is it acidic or alkaline or close to a neutral pH of 7? Veggies like a neutral pH of 7. It will also help you to determine your overall nutrient levels. If you're buying potting soil or topsoil, then you won't need to test your soil initially. The reality is that many gardeners successfully garden without getting a soil test, but not without adding fertilizer to their garden. Composting is a great way to add organic matter to your soil. It adds a little bit of nutrients as well as helps your garden retain moisture and nutrients and release them when your plants need it. You can compost much of the inedible plants your garden produces, like broccoli leaves, weeds that haven't gone to seed, and pea plants, as well as food scraps, lawn clippings, and raked leaves. Rotating crops is another great thing to do. That means planting crops in the same family in a different place on, say, a 3-year rotation. Different plants tend to use different nutrients in the soil. This may help reduce pests and diseases as well. How much and what type of fertilizer should you add? Fertilizer comes in many forms. There are organic fertilizers or conventional. Some are slow release that can be added once at the beginning of the season. Some are water soluble and are mixed with your water on a weekly basis. A good tell that your plants do not have enough fertilizer is that they are yellow or otherwise discolored. Most fertilizers identify the levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK, on their packaging. The higher the numbers, the higher the concentration. Often, organic fertilizers have a lower concentration of NPK, and rather than having all 3 of the primary nutrients, may only have 1 nutrient, although often they have more micronutrients. They tend to release more slowly than conventional fertilizers. If you add slow-release fertilizer in the spring, you shouldn't have to add any more fertilizer, and it will limit excess runoff into lakes, streams, and rivers. It could also save you money because you're not wasting fertilizer, and it should ensure your plants have exactly what they need. So when and how should you water? You can water your garden with a watering can, hose, sprinkler, soaker hose, or drip irrigation. Right after you plant seeds, you need to keep them moist until they germinate. This can be hard when we have hot, windy springs like we did in 2022. I found myself watering my garden 3 times a day to keep the soil consistently moist. When you water a container, you want to make sure there are a couple inches of space between the soil and the top. You'll fill the container once or twice. When you see water running out the bottom, you'll know you've watered enough. Raised beds require a similar soaking. If you're watering with a hose, it can be difficult to adequately soak the soil. Drip irrigation is an ideal way to get water only to the plants you're growing, not to the weeds, and water slowly enough that you're not washing away soil. This is especially important right after you've planted seeds. You don't want to wash away your seeds or small seedlings. When should you weed? The best time to weed is as soon as you see a weed, when it's small. The next best time is to pull weeds before they go to seed. And the very last best option is to pull weeds after they've gone to seed. When your plants are small, it can be difficult to decide what is a weed and what is not. Labeling what you planted and learning to recognize plants when they're small will really help you get ahead of the weeds before they take over your garden. It's especially important with things like carrots, which have a slow start. Transplants can help your garden get a head start as well. When should you think about pests? Prevention of pests and diseases is always going to be easier than when after an outbreak occurs. The next best thing is to catch them early. When should you harvest? As mentioned earlier, plants bolt or go to seed quickly in Alaska. For some crops like radishes and spinach, you may only have a couple days window to harvest the crops before it bolts. Other crops get woody or bitter if they're harvested too late. Zucchini can grow gigantic, seemingly overnight. Most people won't mind a giant zucchini in bread, but in a stir fry, they are best when they are smaller. For quick maturing crops, you may want to plant successive crops so that you have a more continuous harvest. How do you remember what you learned from last year? Keep a garden journal so that you remember what grew well, what you liked, and what didn't do so well. You don't want to repeat the same mistakes every year. Record what you like and what performs well in your garden. Keep track of what crop and variety you planted and when productivity level and harvest dates, if you liked it or not, or if you had too much or too little. Finally, have you heard of the Cooperative Extension Service? At the University of Alaska Fairbanks Cooperative Extension Service, we answer questions, publish informational handouts, create videos like this one, and teach hands-on and virtual classes for Alaska gardeners new and old. You can count on our resources being research-based and free of advertising. Cooperative Extension is a resource across the U.S., so wherever you go, there is someone with local gardening or farming expertise there to help you. Finally, the best advice if you've never ever gardened in Alaska before is to jump right in and give it a try.